Good. Well, I'd like to thank Professor Milani for inviting me, and Hamid and Christine Moghadam, a series in Iranian studies here. It's a delight to be here with you all, and it's really a great honor. I'm going to speak to you tonight about the subject of anti-clericalism. And I hope to give you an idea of the basic groundwork of the topic. I originally worked on this book, Hafez and the Religion of Love. It's up there on the screen, and I wrote an article on Hafez's anti-clericalism there, and then a few years later, this was 10 years ago, I edited this volume on Hafez, and then a few years later I received a grant to write a book on the poets of the Mongol and the Timurid period. And so I spent a whole year researching that, and I discovered that all the poets of this period, and I had about 50 poets I was studying, all of the poets were basically, they had these anti-clerical themes. And so when Dr. Milani invited me, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to expound on this topic, which I hadn't done so far. So it's wonderful to be able to do this and to show the sort of background, how this sort of permeates Persian literature. So the dominant attitude of the sort of anti-clerical rhetoric in Persian poetry is that it's permeated by criticism of judges, lawyers, ascetics, spiritual advisors like the Nase, the Qazi, the Faqih, and authority figures of that nature. And this is one of the reasons that makes this poetry still relevant. It's not, a lot of people today really can't read Milton because anti-clericalism is no longer part of the normal vocabulary. We're in a secular society, mostly in the West. So the conflict between the clerics and the anti-clerics and between nomianism and antinomianism doesn't exist so much. But that's not the case in the Middle East at all. And so this poetry is very relevant. Now, when literary historians talk about genre, they usually divide the genre that I'm talking about, which I think is wrong, but they talk about hazl and tanz. And hazl is a kind of, you could say, body verse, and tanz is satire or parody or polemic. And it's the opposite of you have haz and you have hajv, which is a kind of invective. So you have mad, which is panegyric, and then invective, which is hajj. And so they try to sort of talk about the anti-clerical rhetoric as within those genres. And I don't think that's right for reasons that I'm going to explain. But my own interpretation is like this, that the anti-clerical rhetoric is subsumed under the category of kofriya, or songs of infidelity, and that's the basic genre. And its two subgenres are the Calendario genre and the Cabriya genre. So that's the way I would divide it. And the songs of kofriya, or the songs of infidelity, are using deliberate anti-Islamic imagery or non-Islamic imagery, usually from the lexicon of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, or Christianity. And it's to glorify the sort of transcendent mystical realization of the poet, of the mystic. And again, the kofriya is subsumed under a higher genre, which is the genre of shatiyat, or ecstatic sayings. And so these are the sort of literary genres, and there are other. There's a Kharabati genre, the genre of tavern haunting. But these are the basic literary genres that I'm going to be talking about, and I hope to show how they relate. Now, there are, I think, 5 spheres of poetic inspiration, which is the basis of these genres. And the reason that literary historians don't talk about it is because nobody wants to go there. It's a subject that is really quite difficult. You don't want to venture into the deep and murky waters of Islamic mysticism, God forbid. And so, but I'm going to do that, and I'm going to try to make it very simple as I can. So, what are these 5 spheres? So this sphere of erotic theology, well, you know, in the 12th and 13th century in Europe, you had the rise of love mysticism, yeah? And there was an erotic theology involved with love mysticism. It's the same in Islam. But unlike the courtly tradition in the Christian West, the love mysticism in Islam is not viewed as a heresy. It's antinomian, but it's accepted. Okay, it's against the law, so to speak. It's anti-Sharia, but it's accepted as valid. Love could be a sin, but it's not a heresy. Unlike in the West, the Catholic theologians were attacking the whole tradition of courtly love, and you know, the Inquisition was after the Albigensians and the Cathars and these people who preach this religion. But the basic teaching here of sort of the erotic theology teaching that's going on is that you're contemplating the divine through the medium of the human form. So you fall in love with the human form, and that becomes the shawhead, that becomes the witness of the divine. And you find this elaborated in Arabic in the writings of Ibn Dawood in the 11th century, 12th century, and in Ibn Hazm in Spain. And then it's picked up by Ahmad Ghazali in the 12th century, the brother of Abu Hamid Ghazali, and then Ruse Bagli again in the 13th century. And so this becomes a systematic mystical theology, which is elaborated by the Sufis. And both in the West and the East, the taboos of the love mysticism breaks taboos. You know, in the West, the lover was the vassal, and he was in love with the lady who was divinized, and she's the divine being, and it's adultery, and it's an idol as well. So everything is subverted. The man's supposed to be on top, but here the woman's on top. In Islam, a similar situation occurs, but it's even more radical, where the beloved is the Tarsa Bache. It's a Christian girl, or it's the Molk or it's the Molk Bache, the Christian or the Zoroastrian girl or boy. There's no gender in Persian, so you don't know whether it's man or woman. So the hierarchy of a believer and infidel is inverted. So the infidel becomes God. So this is part of the Kofriya genre. So that in brief is what I call the sphere of erotic theology. And then there's the sphere of aesthetic psychology, which is by using this imagery of infidelity and blasphemy, which is in your handout, and we're going to go over some of the verses, the poet or the mystic tries to mortify his passions and expose the iniquity of his carnal soul, of his nafs, and show that his soul is the cause of infidelity. See? It's very subtle. The sphere of Melomati spirituality, I'm going to talk at length about that in a moment, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But basically, the end of the spiritual path is fana. Fana means self-annihilation, to make yourself disappear. So in order to find self-annihilation, fana, you have to pass through the valleys of heresy. You have to become a heretic. First of all, you have to declare yourself as a heretic, and then you have to be called a heretic by everyone. So you have to suffer abuse. And that's what the Malamatis were all about. There was a school of blame. So this is not libertinism. This is a deliberate use of libertine language to mortify the soul. So this is what I call Malamati spirituality. I'll go into it in a bit more detail in a moment. And then the sphere of mystical theology. There's a whole theology behind this use of the imagery of infidelity, which goes back basically to Hallaj, Mansur Hallaj, who was martyred for saying, "I am God" in 922. Yeah? You all have heard of Hallaj, no doubt. And one of his teachings is that there are two great teachers. One was Iblis, Satan, and the other was Pharaoh. Yeah? Sounds very radical, right? Well, this is what Hallaj says. He says here, "My friend and teacher are Satan and Pharaoh. Satan was threatened with the fire, but he did not go back on his preaching." And this, of course, goes back to the Quran, the story of Satan, of Iblis. "And Pharaoh was drowned in the Red Sea, but he did not acknowledge any mediator at all. And if I am killed or crucified or my hands are cut off, I will not go back on my preaching." This is what he writes in the Tawasin. Of course, he is killed, and he becomes the great martyr. So this whole idea of the mystic, of the poet martyring himself for love is this sphere of mystical theology. So you have to know that whole background. They're all in a tradition going back to Bayezid Bistami and Hallaj. Now, the sphere of contemplative discipline. There's a kind of visionary landscape which is involved that the pilgrim has to pass through, and that landscape involves traversing a kind of terrain which is you are going to encounter infidelity, and you're going to embrace infidelity, and then you're going to emerge on a higher level of faith. And this is the Hermetic symbolism of Persian poetry, which everybody knew. It was publicly, everyone had an idea of what it was, and it was written down in dictionaries. But unfortunately today, a lot of people don't even know what's going on. And you have to go back to, because we live in a society which is based on concepts. We're not feeling, it's a propositional mechanism. We use concepts to embrace this instead of, we don't feel it anymore. So this is problematic. But anyway, these are the 5 spheres of poetic inspiration that I would say the Kofriya genre is based on. Here, I'd like to hand out. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the antinomian traditions in Christianity as well, because the word anti-clerical, we don't have a translation in Persian for anti-clerical, really. And so I'm using a Christian vocabulary, so I have to sort of show what I'm doing. But there's a common, what I call a common esoteric ground of Islamic civilization, Persian civilization in particular, because it's more common in the Persianate world than it is in the Arabic-speaking world. And it's characterized by broad-mindedness, what's called by the theologians latitudinarianism. They have great latitude. And this was considered normative by the majority of Muslims. In other words, this type of language, this kofriyajan, is normative. Everybody knows it. And they say, oh, well, that's what it is. And this was part of the whole Sufi tradition. The Sufis were tolerant. The exoteric ulama were intolerant. I mean, these are generalizations, obviously. The Sufis concentrated mostly on internals. The fuqaha and the ulama zahir concentrated on externals. But this is pretty well known. But the Kofriyajan is based on a unitive metaphysic. It's based on a philosophy of Tawheed, of divine unity. But it's antinomian. And you have to realize in various religions there's a different attitudes towards antinomianism. In Christianity, antinomianism is a heresy. In Buddhism, antinomianism, in Zen Buddhism, antinomianism is part of the Buddhist tradition. In Chan Buddhism in China, it's part of the Buddhist tradition. And in Islam, the Sufi tradition is part of the Islamic tradition, and even the Kofriyajan is part of the Islamic tradition. So they're not opposed to each other, and this needs to be emphasized. Another thing I'd just like to comment on is that scholars often have this sort of two-tiered model of religion. So you have high Islam and you have low vulgar Islam, and the low vulgar Islam, the epitome of the vulgar Islam is the Islam of the vagabond, of the qalandar, of the wandering, Sufi. And I'm going to talk about the Calendario Movement in a moment. So you find a lot of scholars, respectable scholars, telling you that, and I'm thinking here of the late Fazl Rahman. He writes here, the phenomenon of popular religion during the post-Mongol period is based on a metapsychosis, which rendered it at the mercy of spiritual delinquents. So all of these people are characterized by him as spiritual delinquents, which I think is completely false. But worse than false, well, not worse than false, as bad as being false, it's a misunderstanding, a gross misunderstanding, because there's no reason to push these type of teachings to the periphery of Islamic thought. And in fact, in the time that these teachings existed, in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, they weren't at the periphery, they're at the center. And it's just because of the Salafi polemic, which we have today, funded by Saudi petrodollars, that this type of vocabulary is no longer considered to be acceptable. So this interpretive space of Islamic discourse is become confined to a sort of narrow fundamentalist ground. The whole tradition of tasawwuf and kalam is sort of been silenced. I mean, the sort of mystical kalam is what I'm talking about here. So anyway, I think we have to dispense with the sort of monolithic perspective which looks on Islam as just confined to some sort of narrow orthodoxy, and anyone that disagrees from that orthodoxy is wrong. Now, to go into the anti-clerical side of Christianity a little bit, my vocabulary is a Christian vocabulary, but it makes sense in Islamic context. In Western antiquity, antinomianism goes back to St. Paul's polemics against the Mosaic law. And he writes that the believer should be justified by the hearing of faith rather than the works of the law. And he says that the works of the law are dead to the law by the body of Christ. The works, those who are dead to the law by the body of Christ. In other words, the true believers are alive through Christ and dead to the law, and they're delivered from the law, inspired by the Spirit of life in Christ, and free from the law of sin and death. Now, so this is the teaching of St. Paul, and it's central, very much central to Protestant Christianity, and it's known as the doctrine of justification by faith as versus the doctrine of justification by works. Paul is saying you're justified by your faith. In other words, if you have a pure heart, if you have the divine grace, then if you omit to practice certain rituals and rites, then it's not such a terrible thing. And by the end of the 18th century, you find a lot of antinomians contrasting the gospel of Jesus and the forgiveness of sin against the gospel of Moses. And here, and this is known in Islamic thought, it's known as the contrast between the Sharia-centric ulama and the tariqah or the haqiqah-centric ulama. And again, I have an illustration here from a wonderful book, Pilgrim's Progress, which has so much Sufi language in it. It's amazing. And here is the pilgrim Christian, and he's got the burden of sins on his back, and he's reading from the Gospels that's liberating him from his sins. And he meets Mr. Worldly Wiseman, who says, why don't you go to the house of legality, and he will free you from your sins. And he says, okay, I'll go there. And he goes there, and he sees this huge mountain. It's about to fall on him, and his friend, the evangelist, comes along and says, this legality, and I've put it up on the board, he can't free you from your burden, not by the works of the law. No man living can be rid of his burden by the law. He's an alien, and legality is a cheat. And you find the same vocabulary in Protestant Christianity of being opposed to the law. And John Bunyan is a Puritan. He's a Puritan, but he's an antinomian Puritan. John Milton is a Puritan as well. So this is the type of vocabulary, and it's very relevant to the discussion tonight. Anyway, if it's not relevant, it puts my own vocabulary, it sort of puts a light on my own vocabulary, where I'm coming from. And then you have a whole tradition of anti-clerical poetry in English, of course, and here I've just selected some verses by certain rather minor poets. And the anti-clerical tradition in English poetry, with the exception of two poets, in my opinion, at least in the 19th century, Shelley and Blake, is mostly in this genre. It's in the genre of basically tanz and hajj. It's not in the genre of kofriya, as you see here. So they're actually being opposed to the priests, being opposed to the church. And there's no message, a higher message, so to speak. So these are some species of anti-clerical verse. But what I'd like to do, because I don't want to spend my time just on this, I want to pass on to my analysis of the basic anatomy of anti-clerical poetry. And to that end, we're going to read Shelley. Okay, and that's on your handout. It's Exhibit 2. And I'd like you to look at that. I have it on the screen as well. If you don't want to read, you can read it up there. And I'm going to compel Shelley's, this is from his Ode to Liberty, and it's one stanza of his Ode to Liberty where he's attacking the whole idea of to be a priest. You shouldn't be a priest, and the priests are the lowest of the low. And I'm comparing this to Rumi, some verses in Exhibit 1 in the Masnavi, where Rumi has similar pronouncements, okay? And because my time is limited, I can't read off all the poetry, and I have 36 exhibits to go through tonight. So I'm just going to have you read them, and you can take them home and think about them as well. But you have it there, and you've seen it on the screen, but this is basically the anatomy of the spiritual psychology of this anti-clerical poetry. So first of all, you have a movement from the exoteric reality to the esoteric one. So Shelley is saying that every individual has to find their mental strength. The wise from their bright minds would kindle such a lamp within the domes of this dim world that the pale name of priest would shrink and dwindle. So you have to illumine yourself. Again, Rumi in his Exhibit 1. How many of you don't know Persian here? Okay, so I can't just quote Persian. All right. So I have the English translations anyway there. But so Rumi is saying, ma ke ba tanbin jumla keshvarim bedel bengarim wa zahir nangarim. We see the inner life of all the whole world, and we don't look. We look at the heart. We don't look at the outward. So again, it's the same movement that you find in Rumi. In both poets, there's a movement away from the conventions of human society towards the human soul. Again, the same verse that I quoted by Rumi, and Shelley speaks of being able to contemplate the truth within the nakedness of false and true. Both poems attack the deceit and hypocrisy of the clergy. Rumi says, "Ghaziyan ke be zahir mitanan hukm bar ishqal zahir mikunan." The mullahs or the judges who just pass judgment on externals, and they judge great believers to be infidels, like Hallaj, for instance. Both poets are attacking priestcraft, deceit, and hypocrisy. Both poets, and again I have it up here on the board, both poets there's a movement from the priest or the mullah to the hierophant or the Sufi or the Aref. The idea of personal imitation, of personal realization versus blind imitation is there in both of them. Rumi says, Jad konta piro aglo din shavi tatu aglo totu boten bin shavi. Try to be the master or the teacher of religion and intellect. So like the universal intellect, you see everything. So there's a movement to personally verify your teaching. The same thing you find in Shelley when he asks that human thoughts kneel alone before the divine throne. And both poets are this anatomy of anti-clericalism, they're both moving towards ecumenism from exclusivism. So these are some of the positive messages of the anti-clerical genre. Now, when literary historians talk about this genre, they usually say, well, it's not. I'm not going to say who said this, but a famous scholar said this. And I think it's not a literature of reduction. It's a literature of amplification, because it's against Kant, it's against bigotry, it's against literalism, it's against formalism, and it's elevating the soul to a higher level of understanding. And this is clearly explained in Exhibit 3, which I've gotten. There are two great anti-clerical poets in the world. One is Hafez, who's the greatest in the world, and the other is Blake. These are the two fundamental, and they're religious poets. They're both very religious poets, but they're anti-clerical as well. You know, in the sphere of mysticism, you can combine opposites, black and white. Everything is an oxymoron. So you can be anti-clerical and religious as well. And Blake is very religious, and he's very anti-clerical. So I have a selection there from Blake that you can read at your leisure, which shows this anti-clerical side. And I should just say that when the type of, I have to sort of talk a little bit about religious studies, but when we're talking about this type of discussion, religion is usually, we have, what you should do in society, how you should behave with people, make sure you're a good person, do good deeds, be nice to everyone, that's religion. Or no, go to church once a week and make sure you follow Mujtahid and do it exactly what he says and be part of the community. Or no, make sure you know the right teachings, read all the right books, study theology, and know the tradition. Well, no, what we're talking about here is the existential way of looking at religion. What is in your heart, what is in your soul, and how do you know God, and do you have hypocrisy in your spiritual life or not? So this is what we're talking about. These are different ways of looking at religion. This is the way that the anti-clerical poetry approaches the whole study of religion. And I should just conclude this part of my talk by saying that anti-clericalism is now an obsolete topic, really, in modern Western discourse, not in Iran, not in Tajikistan or Afghanistan, but in the West because of secularism. And when I was preparing this lecture, I came across this 3,000-page book, 6 volumes, called Religious Trends in English Poetry, which begins in 1700 and ends in 1965. And the first 3 volumes in their indexes have 20 entries on anti-clericalism, up to 1830. After 1830, there are no entries on anti-clericalism or antinomianism or priestcraft because it's obsolete. With the rise of secularism in the 19th century, the poets and the literary historian, the writers are no longer interested in this subject. So, but it is relevant, very much so, to contemporary Iranian studies, obviously. Now, in Islam, the attitude towards anti-clericalism is based on two traditions. One is the Malomati tradition, which I mentioned briefly before, and I'll just go into that a little bit. These are the key teachers, the Malomati teachers of the 9th and 11th century. And the Malomati school basically are nonconformists. They've been compared to the Cynics of the 4th century Athens. They are accused of being heretics, libertines, freethinkers. Their basic teaching is that al-harakat, al-harakat al-qulub ashrafu min harakat al-jawari. The actions of the heart are superior to the actions of the limbs. So you have to have fiqh batin, you have to have jurisprudence of the heart. You have to know what's going on in your heart. And in order to do that, it's better that you be abused and you're blamed by people, because that purifies you. So they were called the school of blame. And they deliberately behaved in a scandalous manner to attract blame to themselves. And they were trying to escape from hypocrisy. And in your handouts and exhibits 4, 5, 6, and 7, I have some verses of Hafez, which are in this Alomati tradition, where he is opposing hypocrisy, ruyo riya, and he's behaving technically in a Malomati fashion. So again, if you go back to my 5 spheres here, this is the sphere of Malomati spirituality, which he's expressing in these lines that I've quoted. So, he says it's better to drink wine in public than show off your piety in public. You see? Why is that? Because, if you drink wine in public, you get attacked by everyone and you feel humiliated. That's better than showing off your piety in public and everybody says, bah, bah, bah. How spiritual he is, So it's better to behave in a scandalous manner. And this was the Malomati teaching, and Hafez is full of that. And of course, the actual teachings, the Malomati teachings, I got 10 different teachings here. And just to give you an idea, submitting yourself to blame, renunciation of ambition for rank, avoiding of ostentatious display of piety, renunciation of hypocrisy, criticizing all social institutions, whether they're academic, religious, governmental, or mystical, renunciation of kashf karamat, not wanting to have any powers, concealing the shortcomings of your neighbors and exposing your own, repudiation of egotism and conceit, affecting to be impious, to be shameless. This is called la oboligari. This is the way the Malomatis were, And lastly, the key teaching is salvation through love. They all have to have love. So this is the Islam of the Malomati school, which was dominant. It's very central to teachings from basically the 10th century to the 15th century, for 5 centuries. Now, the other movement, which is very important for the anti-clerical genre, is the Calendario Movement, and this is another nonconformist tradition. It's actually an offshoot of the Malomati school, and the Calendars are the counterparts, you could say, of the Hindu sadhu in India, and they're vagabonds, and they would shave their facial hair, or their eyebrows even, their mustache, their everything, and wander around, sometimes naked. And they became a social institution. They had their own tariqats, their own silsile, and they had their own hanagahs. They were in Egypt, they were in Libya, they were in Iran, they were in Central Asia, they were in India. And in Exhibit 8, if you look on your handouts, I have a sort of the classic quotation on the Calendario and who they are. And I just draw your attention to certain things here. The first sentence here are those over whom intoxication predominates and rules the tempers of their heart. In other words, they're mastullah. They're drunk with God. Masked. And they wreck all the mores of society, okay? And they reject the normal usages of society and social relationships. And you go to, in the middle, he says, they persist in rejecting miserliness, accumulation of wealth. They have no respect for observing the rights of people, rights of ascetic. And at the bottom, he says, they're not tied down by external circumstances and forms, and they're indifferent. Again, he uses the word la'abali. They're just concerned with the sweetness of their heart. So this is the Calendar tradition. Again, this is central. There's a whole genre of poetry. Most of this poetry is written in the Calendar genre. So this is a genre. Everybody knows about it. Most of Sanai's Qazaed are in their Calendari Qazaed, his odes. He's the founder of the Calendari tradition. Now, I provided some examples of medieval Calendariyat poetry, which is part of the anti-clerical genre, in exhibits 9 to 14 in your handout, if you care to take a look. So I'm not going to read them because, I can't read everything in the space of an hour. But you have them there. You can take them home and look at them, and you can sort of get an idea of what I'm talking about. And I've highlighted in bold the word calendar. And so you see this type of attitude. Look at Exhibit 11, for instance, by Rumi. Isn't it shocking? Isn't it shocking? But this is part of the calendar genre. Okay, this is a genre of poetry. You don't want to take it too literally, because I'll quote you verses of the Masnavi where he says, "I worship the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad." This is part of the genre. Okay, so you have to look at you have to be a bit subtle. This is nuanced. Okay. The Thoreau in his Walden says, the Orientals tell us that Kabir's poetry has 7 levels of meaning. And today, when if a man's poetry has more than 1 level of meaning, they find this objectionable. He calls this potato rot of the brain. Yeah. So, you have to have a bit of nuance here when you're reading this. And the last exhibit there, exhibit 15, I've quoted Hafez, and everybody loves Hafez, but you see he's talking about the story of Sheikh Sanan, who was a Qalandar, in love with his Farsa Bache. So again, this is part of the Qalandari genre. Now, to move on, I just want to show you the groundwork again of this poetry, and I have 2 prose writers who are the top level of Islamic thought. Ibn Arabi is the Sheikh al-Akbar, died in 1240. He's the greatest Sufi master in the Arab-speaking world and sort of the defender of the Sufi tradition, author of monumental works. And I just have a small quotation from him where he talks about the opposition of the ulama-i batin to the ulama-i zahir, the opposition of the esoteric teachers to the exoteric teachers. And that's in Exhibit 17. In Exhibit 16, I have a quotation from Mohsen Mahdi, where he talks about this bifurcation of the esoteric and the esoteric. And that gives you an academic exposition of the difference between these 2 groups. And you can read that at your leisure, and that's something I've given you to take home and think about. But I'll skip that and go on to Ibn Arabi. Now, of course, these 2 groups, the fuqaha or the ulama zahir and the Sufyan or the ulama batin, they're complementary. They're not always opposed. Ibn Arabi wrote 2,000 pages of his Futuhat on fiqh, so he's a great faqih. Okay, Sheikh Bahai is a Qalandar writer, but he wrote the Jama Abbasi. He's a great faqih as well. So they complement each other. They're not always opposed. But it should be emphasized that this tradition is responsible. The Qalandariya tradition and the Sufi tradition in general, the Qalandariya tradition in particular, is responsible for preserving the fine arts in Islam, music, poetry, and painting, without this tradition wouldn't exist in Islam. The ulama Zahir would not have favored these traditions. So it's extremely important, and I'll come in my conclusions. I'll come to that. Anyway, if you look at Exhibit 18 here, he's saying here that there's a psychological distinction between the human character types. You have the exoteric fuqaha, this doesn't obviously show even, I mean, I have a book, I'm actually editing a volume here from this conference I organized last year at Exeter on Sufis and mullahs. And there's a whole paper in the volume on Ibn Arabi's perception of the fuqaha. So this is a whole discussion itself, could be a whole lecture. So I'm being very superficial right now, but it gives you a kind of taste of the situation. So I'll move on to the next passage, which is from Ruse Mahana Berkeley, The Paradoxes of the Sufis. And this is a book, a huge book, all on the shatiyat. I said that the shatiyat is a genre which is higher than the kufriyat. Kufriyat comes out of shatiyat. Shatiyat means expressions. When a goblet is full, it overflows, and that's shat. You go into ecstasy and you say things that you don't even know what you're saying. And so he wrote a commentary on the ecstatic sayings of the Sufis. And so he says the whole reason I've written my commentary is to defend this tradition against the exoteric ulama who are attacking it. And he begins with the time of Adam. He says they were attacking us from the time of Adam, and it's going on today. And so if you look at Exhibit 19, there's a whole history of that he's talking about here. I've given you the Persian text and the English text as well. But, you know, he says, look what they did to Hallaj, look what they did to the sheikhs of Iraq, to Shibli, and look what type of people they are, you know, look at their behavior. So this tradition of anti-clerical poetry is based on a mystical theology which you find in Ibn Arabi and you find in Ruse Mahana Berkeley, who are two of the great Sufi thinkers. And I've in Exhibit 20, I've actually put a quotation from Dara Shikoh, who lived 17th century India, where he's actually taking Ruse Mahana's ideas and he's putting them in Persian verse, and you can see how apropos it is of Iran today. If you cannot read these books in the Islamic Republic, this poem in the Islamic Republic of Iran in public. If I were to do that, I would be taken off to prison because they're just too radical. Is that right, Dr. Milani?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You might go to prison even for reading him here.
Well, with Trump, it could happen, you know.
No, not in America. But in Trump America as well.
Yeah.
We're talking about Iran.
Anyway, now I've spent a lot of time, and I want to go to the actual poems, and I'll speak for about 15 more minutes and then conclude. So let's look at some of the actual poems themselves and how they take this rhetoric and how they actually use this rhetoric. And these are, as I said, I got the divans of 50 poets, and one of the wonderful things about England is that you can get grants, and they actually give you money that you can buy books and you can take a year off and you know, do your studies. So I found these 50 poets, I got all of their divans, and I've chosen 7 poets or 6 poets tonight that we're going to go over, the ones in italics. And I've put them on your exhibits here. Now, the first one is Nizari. Now, he's a great anti-clerical poet, and most of Hafez's anti-clerical poetry is based on Nizari. And he was a very strange creature. He's an Ismaili, but he's also a Sufi. He's a ecstatic mystic, but he's also an alcoholic. He wrote a book in praise of drinking, the actual physical wine, but then he has a whole section of the book on the spiritual wine as well. So he's a strange creature, and he has all the imagery of the Sufi poetry, but he's a devout Ismaili as well. And so I just have one or two lines here which are very apropos of the present day, and I thought they would be nice to read. I'm just going to read two of the verses of the Persian for you, and I think you all, from Iranians, will enjoy them. I have the English there, so you can read the English as well. فسات و منکر اهل صلات حتی است که آفرین و ثنا واجب است بر اوباش ز درس فقه چی آموختن جز سالوس ز علم و فضل چی اندوختن جز پرهاش. This is Nizari, Exhibit 21. Sorry. And I'll read the English here. The perfidy and vice of the so-called folk of virtue has reached such a point that it is de rigueur that we commend and acclaim anyone who is a knave. Indeed, what have they learned from studying Islamic jurisprudence but the art of imposture, fraud, and humbug? Okay, that's a rather liberal translation, but it gets the point, I think. So this is, and Nizari he has 1,400 ghazals, and this is just one of them. And at least a third of these ghazals are in this anti-clerical Calendario genre. So that's Nizari. We're going to pass on to Amir Khosrow Dehlavi very briefly. He was greatly influenced. He greatly influenced Hafez, and there are lots of the ghazals of Hafez which actually Hafez imitated Amir Khosrow. And he's an extremist, a romantic extremist. And I translate the word rend as romantic extremist. That's my own particular translation. And he's an oshek, he's an erotomaniac. And in Exhibit 22, you see his aversion to Islamic Puritanism and hypocrisy, very well expressed. His best friend is Amir Hassan Dehlavi, and both of them were devotees of Nizamuddin Awliya, a great Sufi master in India at that time. And Hassan Dehlavi wrote a beautiful book called Fawaid al-Fu'ad, which Bruce Lawrence has translated as Morals for the Heart. It's all in praise of their Sufi master, Nizamuddin Awliya. So they're devout Muslims, but they're extreme anti-clerics, clerical poets. And so in Exhibit 23, you see repentance is the first stage of the Sufi path, right? But he's saying here that repentance from love is itself the worst of sins. So you don't want to repent of love. Again, the subtlety involved. Look at Exhibit 24 here. Again, the same thing is repeated. The creed of love, how strange it is that repentance itself is a sin. Exhibit 25, it's the castigation of Zod, of dry ascetic practice, of the Puritan Zohed expressed. And you find this type of language expressed in Hafez. Now, this is a translation of Hafez that I did with Robert Bly, but I didn't put the Persian up because you all know the Persian, right? Does everybody know the Persian? من که شهر شهرم به عشق ورزیدم منم که دیده ندیدم نیالودم به بد دیدن. If you don't know the Persian, you can read it, the English. ز می پرستی ز اون زده ام نقش خود بر آب تا اینکه خراب کنم نقش خود پرستیدن. See? It's exactly what I was telling you about in this Calendario genre. وفا کنیم و ملامت کشیم و خوش باشیم که در طریقت ماست کافریش رنجیدن. به پیر میکده گفتن که چیست راه نجات بخواست جام می و گفت عیب پوشیدن. Don't to cover up people's faults if you want to find the path to salvation. So again, all of this whole anti-clerical genre that I was talking about is quite clear. Anon به میکده خواهم تاخت از این مجلس که وضع بی عملان واجب است نشنیدن. مبوس جز لب یار و جام می حافظ که دست زلفروشان حتاس بوسیدن. So you see this type of language that they're using. So if we go on to Amir Hassan de la Vie, one of the interesting things, or the socially relevant aspects of this poetry is it's ecumenical. It embraces all religions. So anti-clericalism leads to ecumenism. And you see this in Exhibit 22, where in Exhibit 26, where he says, what of the church, what of the Kaaba? We're detached from it. We're in the creed of Qalandars. So the next poet I want to go to is Ohadi. On page 14, I have some poems from him. And he's an important Persian poet. We have so many great Persian poets that it's hard to classify anyone as major because there's so many great poets. I think there are 11 great major poets, but that's my own classification. But Ohadi is a great poet in his own right, but he's third rate because there's so many great poets. And he wrote this wonderful Masnavi called Jam Jam. But he's a much better ghazal writer than he's a Masnavi writer, in my opinion. He advocates the same. In his Masnavi, he's a Zahid. He's very abstemious and he has a completely different attitude. But in his ghazals, again, it's a literary genre. He's very libertine-like. And he contrasts in Exhibits 27 and 28 the figures of the Zahid to the lover, the ascetic to the jurisprudent. So you can see what he's saying here, that these two ways are separate. And you have to follow the path of love. And again, it's very much like John Bunyan and the opposition of Eros and Nomos, of the way of the law versus the way of love or the way of faith. So this is very similar to everything that we've read so far. And then the other aspect of this tradition is the unity of religions. And you find this in Ohadi's verse in Exhibit 29. Gasht kalam o notq mukhtalafan dar varaq varne khuda behaq dar hame adyan yakist. So God is the same in all religions. So this is an interesting point. And I just Exhibit 30 as well, the same idea is expressed. And Shabistari is probably the greatest exponent in verse of this. And of course he wrote a Masnavi, he didn't write any ghazals, but he has this idea, and I've just put some verses of Shabistari in Exhibit 31. Musulman gar bedunisti ke bod cheez, bedunisti ke dindar bod parastiz. What is it? Vagar Moshrek zebot aga gashti kuja dar din khod gomra dashti. This is in Exhibit 31. Nadi dar u illa halq zahir bedin illat gash dar shar kafir tu niz gar nabini daru hak penhan besharan dar nakhonanat Musliman. So you have to see God in the idol. This is the Islam of the anti-clerical poets. Okay? So, the last poet I want to consider is Hoju. He is the second great poet of the 14th century after Hafez. He's a panegyric poet. He was known as the portrait painter in verse. You wanted your portrait painting, you go to Hoju and he'd write you qasida. and he was a paid poet, but he was a devout mystic as well. His master was Aminuddin Baliani, who belonged to the Khazaruni order, and he wrote 2 Masnavis in praise of Baliani. Hafez was also devoted to Baliani and imitated Baliani's Divan. I've gotten Baliani's Divan. It was only published 5 years ago. I got his Divan. You can see the correspondences between Hafez and Baliani. And Hafez actually praised Baliani in verse as well. But anyway, Haju is, one of these great poets and very, very close friend of Hafez. And he influenced a lot of other poets as well. So if we turn to Exhibit 2032, it was interesting. This line sort of jumped out at me when I was studying Haju, because I remember this older man, I was asking him, what do you think about the religiosity of the exponents of Shiite Islam in the present-day Iran? And he quoted me this verse. It was written 700 years ago by Haju in Exhibit 32. Kofr din yeksan shamar Haju kedar lohe bayan kafri bartar zizod riyai yafta. This is an elderly gentleman in his 70s quoting me this verse of Haju. He had memorized this, and this was Iranians, they love poetry, and so if they want to express their deepest feelings, they express it in poetry. So anyway, if you go on to this Malamati ethic, this pursuit of notoriety and ill fame, badnami, which you see in all the poetry of the period. Ashaqan ra ba tariq zod o taqwa. Izzat der Mawlana Sakan Masjid Maju. Oh, please, yeah. Everybody have this or not? Yes. Yeah, okay. Kafiri Makkah Chidonat Hormata Beta Haram. So, the same type of rhetoric you see here in Haju that we've seen so far. The last poem I want to quote from Haju is in Exhibit 35. And again, this idea of the sacred space of the heart being superior to the external mosque. Yeah? And he says here, Manzela yargarinas chiduzak chibahesh sojdagogar banyazes to masjid chikanesh. If you have the faith inside you and if you have love of God within you, it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in a synagogue or whether you're in a mosque. And Hafez took that line and he wrote a famous verse which all Iranians knew. He's using the same meter, the same rhyme as Haju. So that's my talk this evening, and I have some conclusions that I'm coming to. And I have a selection from Ain al-Ghazat that I put there at the end, and he's the founder of Sufi metaphysics. And, the chief disciple of Ahmad Ghazali, and a very important figure, almost as important as Abu Hamid Ghazali, and he's just becoming known in the West now, and in Iran as well. And I have a selection from him which you can take home and read, which gives you an idea of this opposition of the law to love, which is fundamental to the Islamic tradition of the Kofri Ajam. But just to conclude, what I wanted to say here. This antinomianism and this anti-clericalism is never blasphemy for blasphemy's sake. It's a counter-ethic of bacchanalian piety at the service of love, utilizing a calendari lexicon of the profane to scoff at religious cant and sanctimony. It's anti-clerical. It lampoons the rites and rituals of Sharia-oriented clerical Islam, mocking the fundamentalist sanctimonious Puritan, and judging infidelity as superior to displays of hypocritical ascetic piety. So that's my conclusion in general, and there are other conclusions, and these are my other conclusions. Now, what is the genre? It belongs to the genre basically of the ghazal. It's less prevalent in the rubayat and in the masnavi. And in antinomian poetry in Islam. So it's a non-rational poetic erotication of nomocentric Islam. So the legalistic Islam has been eroticized. You know, in the 12th, the 13th, 14th century, the most important discussion among the poets was love. Do we have any love poets today? No. It's no longer fashionable. It's you know, at the most you have a few, you know, Pablo Neruda, I don't know, a few. But do we have any great American love poets? No. No. It's no longer in fashion. But this was the dominant way the poets spoke about. Love was the most important theme. So this is what it is. It's a non-rational poetic eroticization of nomocentric Islam. It's non-Sharia-centric. It's antinomian. It's associated with these genres that I've been talking about. And it articulates Persian Sufi Malamati doctrines. It's peripheral to normative Islam because it's not Sharia-oriented, and it's on the border of exoteric religious orthodoxy. But it's central to Islamic spirituality, and it's still relevant to the, you know, if you go to India and you go to listen to the Qawwalis, they're singing all of this type of poetry. So it's central. And, you know, the most important institution in the 14th, 15th century, 13th century in the Middle East was, after the mosque, was the Hanagha. There were, in the 14th century, there were more Hanaghas, more Sufi Hanaghas than there were mosques. And in India today, you can find that this is the same situation. You go to Hyderabad, there are more Sufi centers than there are mosques. I was in Hyderabad a few years ago, and it's amazing. It's just like it was in the 14th century. So it remains central to the vernacular languages of Persianate civilization in the Indian subcontinent, Ottoman Anatolia. So these poets, such as Ghalib in Urdu, Oftade in Turkish, Kabir, they're using this type of rhetoric, which is taken again from Persianate vocabulary, Persian poetry. And it's central to even non-Islamic Persianate poetry. I'm thinking, I was amazed, I read the Ganjnameh by Emrani, he's a Judeo-Persian poet. And he's using this Kofriya language. It's a Masnavi that he's written. He's a Jew. But he's using, you know, he's quoting Ghazali, and he's quoting Sa'di, and he's quoting Hafez. He's a Jew. But he's using this vocabulary. And it's central insofar as Hafez is, as I said, the most formidable anti-clerical poet in world literature and in Persian literature in general. So it's very central. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the Persian civilization is you have a poet like Hafez, who's the greatest anti-clerical poet. It's tolerant of religious diversity. It's indifferent to sectarian religious divisions. It's ecumenical, of great contemporary relevance to a secularized world, which the world is becoming increasingly secularized. And I love this quotation from Hossein Ziai, Marhum Ziai, Khoda rahmatish kunad. And he says, poetry to Iranian civilization is what philosophy is to the Greek and prophecy to the Judaic. So it's the language of the spirit, you see? And if that's true, then it's central to the Persianate cultures of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. So it's extremely important. It cannot be, it's the language of the heart, basically. And lastly, my own conclusion here is that it's the unconscious lexicon of the Persian soul. And I'm taking this basically from Khorramshahi, where he speaks of Hafez as the spokesman of the collective unconscious of the Persian soul. But this whole anti-clerical poetry itself is expressing the Persian soul. Thank you very much.